Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back. I'm so grateful that you can make it here or make it back from wherever it is on the internet that you happen to drop in from. So one of the questions that I get, being a female, presenting the way I do, looking the way I do, having the cadence of speech that I do, is why exactly I choose to talk about the things I do. Not that, by the way, there is any perfect, fanatic consistency to the things I talk about, but I think at the very least, no one can deny that a discernible area of orbit when it comes to the conversations I want to have is masculinity. First of all, my field discipline of choice is for the most part male dominated. Okay, I'm a programmer. I also, I'm working in STEM. I also teach, I volunteer, I spend a lot of time around people, believe it or not. And I know this might be tough for some of you because it's honestly kind of tough for me to believe sometimes, but yes, I do have a life. I don't spend all of my time rambling, researching, opinionating about everything, about every conspiracy that seizes me.
For the first time, possibly in history, women are admitting they want daughters, not sons. Having a son is seen as an extreme burden to women around the world. You are expected to birth them, educate them, and shield them from conditioning from other boys. All this without acknowledgement. In fact, that very same son may grow up to take his mother's rights away. Women globally are reaching a line of contention, refusing to give birth to life that may become a weapon against them. Against other women, women are refusing to birth their own oppressors. In fact, they are liberating themselves from a life of suffering. Sons are no longer the standard. Daughters are.
And being temperamentally extroverted, as I'm sure is quite obvious, I do appreciate a significant portion of my life being influenced and affected by men, just as much obviously as I appreciate the same influence from women. I don't resent my exposure to the male personality, and I've realized that when you decide to cultivate relationships that eclipse the social calculus of one's gender expression, then what affects the opposite sex, what benefits the opposite sex, what grieves the opposite sex, becomes less an ideological sensitivity and more something with immediate consequence to you, right? Because you have relationships with them. What affects them actually bears weight on the integrity of your closest, most urgent relationships with the opposite sex.
Honestly, seeing little boys just makes me so sad because it's like, you're so cute now, but I know what you will become. I know what you're going to turn into. And there's a small chance that maybe you'll be one of the good ones, maybe you'll be an outlier, but most likely not, most likely not. And that is just so depressing because when they're little boys, they're so cute and sweet and innocent. It's like they don't have to be that way. You can tell that it doesn't have to be that way, but the way that our society is set up is just meant to corrupt them into something that is just irredeemable most of the time.
Catherine, men are horrible. Okay? I have to just tell it to you like it is, honey, but all men are awful, really. And the key is to just find a man who's the least horrible.
It's like, no, maturity tells me that I'm not simply going to dismiss an opinion, a grievance, whatever the case may be from the opposite sex, just because somebody online has instructed me that every statement emerging from the masculine psyche must be filtered through this weird, predetermined interpretive grid that every woman has to adopt. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm an adult, right? We need to start. Okay, I don't want to offend anyone, but really, we need to start, I think, living in reality, living in the real world, which is so honestly painfully ironic because yes, it's obvious, you guys. I spend a lot of time in my head, but I do have people who matter to me.
This is your friendly reminder that most men that you meet are better as concepts, they're better as ideas, they're better as novelties than as actual people. Because 99.9% of the time when they open their mouth, you will be met with disappointment.
And really, if you have a genuine relationship with me, right? If you're my brother, if you are my mentor, if you're my friend, if you are my significant other, I just feel like I owe you more than that. For me, the totality, right, of who you are as a person, who you are as a unique human being precedes any conversation, any controversy that happens to be circulating about masculinity that week, that month, that year. It's not that those conversations, those ideological grievances online don't matter, but for me, like I said, the person, the human being in my immediate life matters more.
You could literally be fighting for your life and a man will still try to have sex with you. And you'll tell them, I'm feeling very overwhelmed with life right now. I'm constantly having emotional breakdowns. I'm not sleeping at night. I feel like I'm fighting for my life. And they be like, I got something that could fix that. And you be like, and what is that? And they be like this. And it's just like, at some point, bro, like, something gotta give. Like, because,
To engage with someone primarily, right, through the lens of their gender expression rather than through the lived knowledge of their character would make me not only intellectually dishonest, not only morally negligent, but it would also make me extractive. Because true relationships demand that we interact with human beings through their complexity, right, not through what they can be conveniently reduced to. And this applies to any type of relationship, because you guys, that proximity is highly affecting. Proximity forces you, and like, excuse my language, proximity forces you to give a damn about things you wouldn't ordinarily in isolation, because exposure and bidirectional investment cause this natural flow of joy, of grievance, of resources, of energy. Everything you share and you indulge in your immediate life, it bleeds into the lives of everybody who is everybody who is appropriately proximate to you. I spend time with young mothers, I spend time with little boys, because I really love children, and I love a rich, non-superficial conversation. So when my friend, for example's sake, tells me that she intends to raise her boys in a way that deliberately suppresses quote-unquote toxic masculine tendencies by let's say by only allowing her boys to play with dolls, encouraging them to avoid traditionally male interests in favor of, more emotionally oriented activities. I'm just not the type of friend to nod or to not ask why, to not interrogate that. I'm just not built that way. I want to have a conversation about it. I want to pick at it. I want to interrogate it. And if I'm blessed enough to have male children one day, I want to make sure that I'm objectively making decisions that are, that are in their best interest as it concerns their familiarizations or otherwise with masculinity. I would like to be confident in the conviction that the decisions that are shaping these boys' development are not merely fashionable, but objectively beneficial to their growth, to their to their preservation in this life. I want to raise kids, boys and girls, that have a chance. And so the first reason I speak about masculinity is quite simple, Unfortunately or otherwise, proximity makes the subject unavoidable. The second reason is a lot more personal. It concerns the way I grew up. It concerns the intellectual environment in which I was raised. For me, and I've been very transparent about my childhood, lots of books, lots of heavy literature, lots of difficult literature. And if you appreciate anything about mainstream classical literature, you'll know that most of it was written by men, okay? Most of it revolves around the same themes, okay? We're talking war, conspiracy, moral catastrophe. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying, you guys. That's not to say at all that writers from other backgrounds made absolutely no contributions to mainstream classical narratives. One does eventually break through the canonized pile and find less culturally monopolized narratives. That is just to say that visibility, organized exposure around a specific cultural ideal. Now, obviously, without some founding taste for a particular type of story, even if you are an avid reader, you're not going to incline to such narratives, to such specific types of stories anyways. My genre preferences are very specific, my general interests are very specific, and I've been told a lot of things. I've been told that the things I'm interested in, I've been told that the things that excite me aren't particularly feminine. I've been told that my general indulgences are not congruous with my presenting aesthetic, and the truth is that's not inaccurate. Like, that is the truth, but it's not something I've been so much, I guess, willing to change about myself as much as I have been willing to understand about myself. I know I'm not the only one who doesn't understand, what informs all aspects of the way a person expresses, the way a person presents aesthetically, the way a person thinks. And I'm not going to pretend that I do. I understand that sometimes I do present quite feminine, sometimes I present quite naive. I can be quite presuming. My natural inclination is to always extend the benefit of the doubt. And that, of course, you can't always do that. But for me, I am truly convicted that expecting the best of someone usually engenders the best of their behavior. Of course, it's not like foolproof, but in general, I like to operate that way. And I know also, being an external processor, I can seem overly discursive in my way to get to the point. These are just aspects about myself that I don't fully understand. I'm aware of them, and again, I don't exhaustively know what informs all of it. I can theorize on bits and pieces, but like all human beings, you guys, what informs the great mystery of the human expression remains volatile, okay? It remains time sensitive, and it cannot all be known. And seriously, I think the same is true in how the world perceives what exhaustively informs all expressions of masculinity, what it is, why no one can seem to concretely define it, why it informs so much emotion, confusion, and most urgently, identity.
I owe it to these 5 women. They have liberated me from the male chauvinist pig within me.
I don't believe that, Yanis.
Well,
I think you were born enlightened, highly intelligent man.
Not. No, I was socialized through misogyny, like most boys. I still remember, as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, that our socialization process as boys revolved around hating girls and treating them like shit.
Do you think that's got better?
No, I don't. I think it's getting worse.
Did it get better?
It did get better, and now it's getting worse.
So that brings me to the founding premise of this conversation, why I wanted to have it in the first place, besides, the questions I've gotten, and why I feel like we're not talking about it properly, or at least we're not asking the right questions when it comes to the way masculinity is expressed and why someone would want to talk about it in the first place. Here's the thing, okay, and unfortunately, not everybody is going to like this. Masculinity, across its countless cultural iterations, is not a human faculty that human societies can simply dispense with. That is not to deny its toxic potential any less than one shouldn't deny femininity's toxic potential. These binary properties of human nature are, to emphasize, okay, please pay attention, to emphasize, not the wholly establishing descriptions of any human entity. They are not a person's primary ontological identity. They are mere faculties, okay? They are not a human being's primary constituents. Because obviously, if they were, many people would be rendered disposable based on whether or not, they could reliably produce those expressions, right? Masculinity or femininity. And we can't live in a world like that. Rather, I think masculinity is best understood as a recurring behavioral, and psychological orientation that emerges in variable degrees across cultures, across societies, across different environmental contexts. And the same must be said about femininity and neutral expression. We're not talking about immutable moral categories. They are not inherently virtuous, they're not inherently corrupt, but again, like any human faculty, they possess both generative and destructive potential. Anger can become tyrannous, we've seen it. It can actually become abusive, even compassion. It can become coddling, okay? It can become overly exercised, especially when you have a pretty strong nurturing temperament. And so we can actually extend that to the idea that femininity, when it is insecure, can slip into psychologically coercive domains, just in the same way that masculinity, when it is insecure, can become tyrannical, right? Can become abusive.
Fun fact about me is that I actually grew up in a misandrist household. This was spearheaded by my dad, who is basically a raging misandrist. I would probably call my mom just a regular feminist. The first thing is that my dad said if my mom ever gave birth to a son, he would not believe that the son was his. He said he would not raise the son, he would probably send the son off somewhere else. Luckily for him, he and my mom had 2 daughters. Growing up, my parents always told me that men were very dangerous. If I was ever in need, I should always go to a woman and never a man. I was also always taught that men were less intelligent than women. My parents would also always use female pronouns when referring to non-gendered things. If there was an object that they were trying to personify, they would always use she. They also told me about how bacteria multiply through replicating millions of daughter cells. For the longest time, I thought that was something my parents made up because they only like daughters. And then I went to school and realized that's what it's called in science too.
Again, whatever your opinions, okay, whether or not you believe that one is more socially urgent than the other, the fact of the matter is that human beings are psychologically disposed to express these faculties in different degrees for different ends, and they cannot be excised from universal human expression, just because one expression has become for whatever reason politically incorrect or sensitive to some people. Like you just cannot do that. It is psychologically incoherent, and I'm sorry I have to say this, you guys, but it is psychologically incoherent to attempt to abolish masculinity entirely, in the same way that it's incoherent to do the same thing with femininity or any other expressive human faculty. One cannot make socially irrelevant a property so deeply structurally embedded in human psychology. I mean, in the same way that you can't abolish things like grief, like ambition, like desire. The attempt to abolish them would be analogous to like disposing of anger because violence exists, or disposing of desire because obviously we know addiction exists. Human faculties are not disposable components of the psyche. They are, I believe, energetic potentials that must be disciplined, directed, and ordered. Societies can redefine, they can restrain, or they can corrupt these faculties. And by the way, that does not at all imply that, neutrality is the ideal human expression either. I think that the capacity to remain detached, to remain observational, objective, it has its own indispensable function in human life. Yet obviously, even neutrality can become pathological, especially so when, mutates into apathy, into passivity, or even into moral indifference. And these properties, when they are exacted against you, can be really painful. They feel like betrayal, honestly. But my point in all of this is that every human faculty, masculinity, femininity, neutrality, whatever faculty that you could think of, they all possess both utility and vulnerability. Now, just give me a second because it looks like it is about to rain. I'm so sorry for the lighting, you guys. I'll be back in a second.
I think that 2008 was our generation's 1929. And ever since we had our generation in 1929, the left failed to put forward a liberating, emancipatory narrative. Even when we did get into government, like I did, we failed. It doesn't matter why, we fought with one another. There was betrayal, there was treachery, there was stupidity, mistakes, and so on. And just like in the mid-war period in the 1920s and 1930s, after the left fails, discontent grows. And then the idea of the masculine, patriarchal rebirth of the nation, which goes hand in hand with the patriarchal family around the patriarch, the paterfamilias. This whole thing becomes a political agenda that is functional to the interests of the cartel running big business. Don't forget that big capital always in the end gets into bed with the fascists, and this patriarchal narrative becomes even more reinforced. So, if you're looking at it from this macroscopic and macro-sociological point of view, then you realize why it all clicks.
I was actually having a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine, and he pointed out to me that the definition of masculinity is really volatile. What it meant 30 years ago is not the same thing we're talking about today. And so considering this, I think it would really help to trace out, the historical and linguistic evolution of the word itself, especially so considering how unpredictable and diverse the emotional reaction is to this word. Even its associated ideas like patriarchy and gender inequity. The point is, all of these words are socially charged and they're tied to, to masculinity. That is why I feel it urgent to familiarize you with the history, because more often than not, we think we're talking about the same thing, when in actual fact, we're not.
I want to explain why masculinity is a prison for men, and why even healthy and positive masculinity can't help men and boys in the way that we want it to. Men don't need more masculinity. Masculinity doesn't say this is how to be a man. Instead, it says this is how to not be a woman. Masculinity tells men and boys that emasculation is their enemy and that we should fear it. And what's emasculation to a man? Emasculation is being called girly, or being called feminine, or being called gay. So we build entire personalities and egos upon not being called those things or not being related to those things, which causes a lot of harm. It causes social harm because when we tell boys to be masculine, it puts the feminine as less than or second to. And what's related to being feminine is being a woman or being female. So we tell boys that being female is undesirable and less than. But it also causes a lot of harm for men because it forces us to repress and discard entire parts of who we are, because masculinity and femininity are just expressions and energies, and the way that I express myself femininely is going to be much different to the way a woman expresses herself femininely, and the way that a man expresses himself masculinely is going to be much different to the way that all other men express themselves masculinely, because it is so unique and individual to each and every person. And when we aim boys towards masculinity, we're actually aiming them towards something that's intangible, undefinable, and immeasurable, and then we wonder why they're lost and why they don't know what to do with themselves.
One of the central reasons I personally believe that conversations around masculinity are so volatile is, again, because of the history of the word itself. And the fact is, the word, like its history is unstable. It also appeared relatively late in the English language. In, I think this was 1748. It was defined as the quality of being masculine. And interestingly, the word masculus is a diminutive form. It means something like little male or young male. This is one of the strangest philological facts about the word, because the term used today to describe, you know, the grand metaphysical category of manhood actually originated as the small, affectionate, diminutive term in Latin. And in Greek, we have the ancient equivalent of masculinity. It actually doesn't exist at all. And the closest we have is this word in Greek, which means excellence of character. For men in ancient times, this manifested more so as Andrea, which is courage. And for women, because women could also express this faculty, it manifested as wisdom, as restraint. The ancients therefore saw masculine excellence primarily as a virtue, as a psychological trait. But the modern conception of masculinity, right, the idea that is embedded in our subconsciouses today, only actually originated during the Industrial Revolution. And for context, before this, just right before this, male identity was most reliably tied to family, land, warfare, religion, which again is not necessarily the idea adopted by the ancients. Oh, but then it changes again, because during industrialization, men are moved to factories, okay, they're moved to urban environments, they are forced to engage in bureaucratic labor. And this, I think, created a crisis of male identity, both because the idea had been so, in some ways, malformed over the years, but also we had this surge in a specific genre of literature. It's the type of genre I kind of spoke to before. Literature, poetry, theories about manliness. Thinkers like Thomas Carlyle and Theodore Roosevelt began promoting very specific and very Western ideals of what it meant to be a man. Things like rugged individualism, muscular Christianity, frontier heroism. And so modern masculinity discourse was born, pulling from this crisis. And I think it's really interesting that when we talk about masculinity, we are pressed about a subject, about an idea that is barely even ancient. In fact, more accurately, had no real ancient expression in those times. Again, like I keep saying, the word masculinity, the idea of masculinity, is a relatively novel term. Anyway, moving on, we have yet a third transformation. I call this the psychological reinvention of masculinity. So under the massive intellectual influence of Jung and Freud, who, as you guys know, I don't like, but whatever, they seem to influence and affect everything during their time. But yes, masculinity then became linked to archetypes, unconscious drives, sexual identity. Later sociologists argued that masculinity is socially constructed rather than inherently biological. Modern sociologists I think her name is Raywin, I think it's Raywin Connell, but they argue that there is no one singular masculinity, but rather multiple masculinities shaped by different cultures. And this view largely dominates contemporary academic discourse. But I think, I agree to a certain extent, but I have a different conviction.
I have to criticize myself sometimes. Weak people can't criticize themselves. So if you're listening to me, at least be willing to say that maybe some of my ideas are wrong. My ideas and your ideas. That to me is strength. That to me is a masculine virtue. Being able to criticize your own side and not get always so emotional and overheated.
You guys, I believe masculinity to be an ordering social principle. The reason it is so socially rugged, again, completely my opinion, the reason it is so arresting to the human psyche is because nobody can deny that masculinity has this way of engendering other expressions to manifest when human beings are exposed to it. And that could mean exposure in its toxic forms or in its purest forms, in its mildest forms. The point is, masculinity engenders other expressions. Masculinity triggers certain human responses. Human beings instinctively, orient themselves around perceived centers of stability. And I think, if you spend your time around any group of more than 3 people, you'll see that we just do this instinctively. I was reading through the work of gosh, I've mentioned him before, Durkheim, and he has this concept of moral forces. And these are just simply defined as visible embodiments of conviction that stabilize collective expectation. Masculinity, I believe, when properly constituted, functions as one of these forces. One of the things that I believe masculinity engenders without having to explicitly command it is respect. That, I believe, is because courage in and of itself is urgent to masculinity. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that courage and masculinity are synonymous. They're not the same thing, okay? Courage is a human virtue. I mean, Aristotle famously wrote, what did he write? He wrote that courage is the mean between cowardice and rashness, right? It's not recklessness. It is disciplined resolve in the place of fear. But you cannot obviously be masculine and not be courageous because you cannot be courageous and be a coward at the same time. And so reading this, masculinity, again, guys, in the very subjective sense that I'm describing it, is courage on behalf of whoever or whatever has no capacity to possess courage. And let me make myself very clear. That courage need not always be exercised in the service of another person. Sometimes it must be exercised in service of one's self, just because it's not clearly oriented for another person. Just because you're not saving the day in service of another person doesn't make you act any less courageous. And in the same sense, it doesn't make you act any less masculine. I truly do believe, you guys, that courage often functions as a form of intrapersonal protection. And I came to this conclusion because I was reading some conclusions from this psychiatrist. His name is Viktor Frankl, and he observed that the decisive battle for the human person is more often internal than it is external. And I'll read out to you directly what he said because, I just think it's brilliant. He says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. I believe that courage occupies that liminal space. You guys, I had a friend whose experience illustrated this principle in a way that I didn't quite understand at the time. But I mean, I'm not even kidding. I do not look at him the same way again. You know who you are. But basically, there was a pretty devastating romantic fallout. Now, obviously, I know his side of the story. He's emotionally aware people tend to take on the burden of whatever could have gone wrong, why it went wrong. Anyway, point is, it was pretty bad. It was the kind of heartbreak that hollows a person out from the inside. He was exhausted, okay? He was understandably pretty pissed off, okay? He was emotionally depleted. He had a lot more patience than I would have in that situation. But the reason I'm telling you this is because it was horrible, and it was heartbreaking to see him in that state. The version of himself that existed in that moment had literally no interest in rebuilding momentum, no interest in believing that life still had meaning beyond the disappointment. But even as he was talking through his feelings, I wasn't even asking him questions. He was literally just processing out loud, which I think is actually quite healthy. But anyway, as he's talking through his feelings, talking through everything that happened, talking through how badly, honestly, this hurts, I remember just thinking that, okay, I hear you. I feel that obviously this is painful, but something within him was refusing resignation. Ultimately, he made a deliberate decision to act and exercise courage on behalf of the part of himself that was too wounded to advocate for its own survival. He managed to pick that part of himself up, not triumphantly, okay, not theatrically, not in a way like, oh, well, whatever, life must go on. And at the time, like I said, I couldn't articulate why it was that witnessing this vulnerability from him affected me so profoundly, because like I said, I mean, he was just talking and I wasn't asking him any questions. I was not interrupting, which is so unlike me. Usually I just want to dig. Like if you say something, I want to ask, okay, but why? Why do you feel that way? No, like in this, I was just quiet. I was just quiet because I was so affected. Like I was so arrested by what he was processing through and how he was processing through it. It was almost like witnessing my friend be so vulnerable in his hurt, yet still advocate for his value, despite the fact that a part of himself was too wounded to want to, right? Too wounded to think about women in any hopeful way in the first place. Like that, his ability to hold both the hurt and the way to move forward in the same space at the same time, it caused, like, genuinely, guys, a very specific, almost reverent feeling, like, within me as he spoke. My witness, right, to his processing engendered something within me I had not felt to that degree before, or at least I've definitely felt it before, but it's so rare. That's why I always take a minute to just, like, sit in it, because it's so strong, like, it's so specific. And the best way I can describe what I was feeling was almost deeper than respect. It was like a type of honor in a way. This is what I mean when I say that a genuine expression of well-composed masculinity always engenders something within the person witnessing it, the person exposed to it. And I felt this way, not because I'd seen him strong, but I mean, I'd seen his internal compass. He didn't need to be invincible in that moment. You know, it was that opportunity to bear witness to his character. You could tell, like, there was this pull towards, I guess, bitterness and nihilism and hatred, I think, of women in romantic relationships, because I've been on the other end of this as, like, a woman. You know, you're heartbroken and you suddenly feel completely disinclined towards men, but there's another part of you that can pull that part of you out of those depths, you know. And it takes a certain type of advocacy for your own character. And I feel like I bore witness to that, and that engendered this respect within me. As another example, sometimes courage means exercising that same preserving action, not necessarily on behalf of yourself, but in protection, in preservation of other people. It can indeed be outward oriented. It means fighting the battle that somebody else cannot, and it means, usually most materially, doing that for the vulnerable. Often it appears in parenting, making sure children are okay, or even just somebody who just does not have the emotional capacity to advocate for themselves. It means, you know, going the extra mile on behalf of them. The anthropologist Joseph Campbell, he observed that nearly every mythic tradition has some iteration of the guardian archetype, the figure effectively who steps in when others withdraw. And in a world, you guys, saturated with corruption, with instability, with volatility, with betrayal, with confusion, an individual who refuses resignation, who refuses passivity, becomes something quite rare, right? An individual like this becomes a stabilizing pillar. Someone who refuses to collapse into the convenience of passivity when the circumstances demand action. And this is why I think masculinity, you know, when properly exercised, becomes a mooring center for societies, for communities, for the broader psychological temperament. Because courage requires something very specific, you know, it requires that you take a position. You cannot embody courage whilst remaining perpetually neutral. Courage requires a visible alignment with something. It could be a principle, it could be a responsibility, it could be a person, you know, it could be a cause. The point is, it is something observable, it is something discernible, it is something scrutinizable, but, you know, at the end of the day, it is something that can be held accountable. In environments characterized by chaos, by confusion, visible alignment becomes profoundly reassuring, because anything that is clear, anything that takes a position, makes sure that everything, like the surrounding context that is unclear, isn't the only thing to exist. Human beings are far less psychologically distressed by opposition than they are by ambiguity. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt warned, well, she didn't warn, but she observed, the deepest crises of modern society are not simply crises of conflict, but crises of orientation. Which brings me to something adjacent, activism. Now, I wanted to talk about this because you guys have gotten in so many fights about this. Because for me, again, this is a very subjective conversation, but I tend to approach activism, anything to do with protest, whatever, with an objectivity that tends to frustrate people. Not because I don't think social justice exists, not because I don't think that these things need to be talked about, but actually because, you guys, I'm deeply concerned with the effectiveness of strategies intended to address a social ill.
Have you guys noticed that majority of the women on this app who create intellectual content are either brown or dark-skinned women? And like, I was just wondering, why is it that there's a very few number of light-skinned women who engage on an intellectual level and create intellectual content? Not all light-skinned women, majority of them, a lot of the times are centered in the male gaze. You know, and I feel as though because they are light-skinned and because from a young age they've been treated like human beings and women because they are light-skinned, and because dark-skinned women have never been treated like women or like with any sort of fragility, we are able to not center ourselves through the male gaze because it's never something that's been given to us. That level of like viewing of like being fragile and soft and, you know, feminine. And I think when it comes to intellect and very intellectual conversations, light-skinned women a lot of the times do not partake in these conversations because they feel as though they subconsciously know that it makes them not soft. It makes them not fragile. It makes them very unpretty. And they lose the very same thing that makes these men treat them like human beings in the first place.
Now, like I said, just like the way masculinity is burdened with these associated ideas, with these associated feelings, the word activism also carries with it a dense cluster of cultural associations. Even if individuals struggle to articulate exactly why, you know, I don't think anybody can deny the fact that the term evokes an entire constellation of ideological imagery. I'm talking identity politics, I'm talking feminism, I'm talking certain victimhood narratives, I'm talking gender antagonism, racial polarization, environmental alarmism, highly partisan political alignments. I could go on and on and on and on and on. The point is, this is not a neutral term. And whether fair or not, these associations have become embedded in the cultural imagination. I think many people just instinctively recoil from the word activist even when they deeply care about social problems. Because given the way you aesthetically present, economically present, culturally present, the way you speak, the way you look, what privileges you may or may not have, there is always a set of talking points that you are expected to be able to apply and hold consistently, and any resistance whatsoever to expound on them frequently in appropriate with appropriate emotional investment makes you in some way complicit in the social ill. That is at least according to them, according to the whatever you know, whatever group you are associated with. Sometimes people's resistance to engage overtly in activism isn't about the nature of the cause. It's about the perceived baggage and ideological burdens, right? The image management involved with supporting the movement. And this is where my disposition diverges quite severely from contemporary activism, because I'm very pragmatic. I'm very type A when it comes to solving problems. Personally, I'm very interested in measurable outcomes. And the truth of the matter is, you guys, most modern activism strategies, okay, I'm talking protests, I'm talking online awareness campaigns, I'm talking viral incentives to post, to change your profile picture, to whatever, to post a black square, to make it purple, to make it green, whatever. All these viral outrage cycles, I find, are materially ineffective in actually solving the social ill beyond simply resurfacing conversations the rest of the world has already been having for the past 50 years, for the past, in some circumstances, for the past century. Resurfacing the same anger, resurfacing the same frustration over and over and over again without any real solutions.
But what is worse than not caring is pretending to care for your own personal gain so that you can look like a good person. I see videos like this all the time on here of people traveling to impoverished countries, filming all these poor people, being like, oh my god, guys, look! They're so poor! Look how lucky we are to be traveling! And then you look in the comment section and everyone's like, oh my god, they are so poor! You are such a good human being! It's so hard being an empath!
My argument is that if the same political, social, or otherwise grievance still needs awareness after it has been like discussed, protested against, or for at the very least, for more than 50 years, then I feel like there's something ineffective about the strategy. I would rather protest with my money, okay? I would rather use my resources. I would rather enact practical legal consequences than simply arouse everybody's attention for the sake of visibility that already exists, that is already persistent. I don't know. I'm not convinced in our era of social media that most of the world is so unaware that awareness campaigns are actually urgent. I'm not saying that it's not important, that it's not critical to have conversations about misogyny, misandry, injustice, whatever the case may be. But at some point, if the statistics surrounding a specific social ill become progressively worse with every passing year, does it ever occur that screaming at people to stop being bad is not an effective strategy? Even objectively, as it concerns protests around corruption, okay? I understand the importance of the conversation, but moral persuasion is not something that you can frustrate a system into. That's why nagging doesn't work just on a normal human being. That's why I feel online activism is particularly ineffective.
So the purpose of all this compassion is supposed to be to drive some sort of behavioral change, to create some sort of tangible outcome for these people that you supposedly feel sorry for. If there's no tangible outcome, what is exactly the point? The defense is always, well, we need to raise awareness. I'm sorry, why do you need to travel to a foreign country to realize that poor people exist? If that's the first time you realize how privileged your life is, we have deeper issues.
It's effectively just a form of rhetorical scolding. And that is why, for me, personally, and I won't judge you if it's what you choose to indulge, but it's something I'm not interested in. And it's not because I'm not a contributor from behind the scenes, especially when it comes to contributing in a material economic sense. I'm simply not going to participate in a performative, online moral theater. And I don't appreciate being told that I am male-centered or whatever the case may be, just because I'm not proclaiming to the world how much I'm contributing, how good of a person I am. When someone in general makes a personal decision to not make a performance about their integrity, it doesn't mean that they don't care about social justice. The effectiveness of an effort matters. The material consequence of a campaign is important. And I think some of us are just very pragmatically minded, and we understand that, you guys, energy is not infinite. To advocate at the real expense of your convenience for something meaningful, to engage in some sort of war of ideas, to engage really in any type of war, requires the relinquishing of its inverse, peace. Peace is just not something that most people are willing to dispense with just to prove that they are on the right side of history, and I don't think that that's a moral indictment on their part. And that brings me to a deeper point about sacrifice, because activism at its most serious level in a lot of ways is a form of war. It is to step into a war of sorts, right? Over ideologies, over injustices, over competing visions of the world. And every war demands a death of some kind. Sometimes it's a literal death, history affords countless examples. Sometimes it's a psychological death, a death of certain conveniences, a death in the street during a protest, a reputational death, a death of identity, a death of livelihood. But regardless of the scale, the principle remains the same, right? You are dying for something, which leads me to my reflections on war itself. As I was saying in the beginning, my general interest in the stories I love, in the books I was raised on, as a child, classics and all that, my interests are very specific. And in particular, you guys know, I love war stories. I love stories of conspiracy, of moral catastrophe. I want to see, even I've been honest about this, I love the Old Testament. I love the brutality. Not because I love violence, not because I love, people dying, but I love a war story. War stories, in my opinion, reveal something so, you guys, profound about the human condition and what we are willing to sacrifice for what is meaningful. I find it incredibly difficult to appreciate a love story that contains no tragedy, no brutality, no, like someone must die somewhere, somehow in the end. And that's just because in my own life, the most brutal, the most honest, the most preserving forms of love are precisely the ones that have been so valuable that they've been threatened. And so they require a fight. A fight is a battle. A battle is a war for what you know is valuable, for what you know is irreplaceable. And that fight could be for a state of mind, like your sanity. It could be for an idea. It could be for an institution, or it could be for another human being. When someone fights for something, they are implicitly communicating that the object of their eventual victory is terribly valuable. It is valuable enough to endure inconvenience, to endure, in some cases, humiliation, sacrifice, death. It requires compromise, right? It requires the removal of immediate comforts. In short, it requires death. So it's not always very romantic. To love something, you have to die in some way to your convenience on its behalf. And that is why I love war stories. Because a story of war is ultimately a story of death. And a love story need not, always be a story of war. But the best war stories are always, in some sense, love stories. Love in its most honest form, not in all ways, but in a really significant way, is the rightly ordered expenditure of death. Every meaningful commitment requires the death of something, the death of convenience, the death of selfishness, the death of indifference. That's why for me, the best war stories always resemble some story of love. Both ultimately revolve around sacrifice, and sacrifice reveals what we truly value. So if you're like me, especially so if you're a female, and you've had people misinterpret your interest in certain themes as too overtly masculine, because you like stories of sacrifice, you like stories of struggle, you're not an explicit romantic, but for whatever reason, that translates into certain disciplines, certain interests that people interpret as less than feminine. I think it's important to just have some grace and also interrogate within yourself, like why you like these stories and what it is you're actually responding to and why you like certain things. Because I know for me, these are not gendered fascinations. These are my internal interrogations of the human condition. I'm trying to understand myself and what people value, what makes me valuable, what makes me disposable, what could make me worth fighting for, who I would be willing to fight for, what I'm willing to fight for. The truth is that anything truly valuable requires somebody willing to fight for its survival, which is why certain fascinations with sacrifice, with war, with battle might not be masculine in the wholly consuming sense. I truly think that the sexes have a lot more common ground than we give ourselves credit for. And one of those grounds of commonality is the recognition of something objectively true, something metaphysically true, that what we're willing to die for ultimately reveals what we believe life itself is worth. So I hope you enjoy this video. I would love to know your comments, love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. You can support me here. Otherwise, thank you so much for indulging me, and I will see you hopefully very soon. Otherwise, you take care and goodbye.